Welcome back to the literature series of the Korea Now podcast. I'm your host, Lea-Henry, and on today's show we have Kim Sunghee. Kim is an SSK research professor at the University of North Korean Studies, as well as teaching literary theory and literature at Yonsei University and Korea University. And today we're going to speak about a single aspect of his research. That is a recent article of his, The Prosody of Working and Narrative Martyrdom, Daily Life and Death in North Korean Literature During the Great Famine and the Early Military First Age. And that title gives away a lot because this is such a fascinating look at North Korean society and just that military first ideal, or Songan. And this is something that people understand that North Koreans hold about themselves. They understand that they self-describe as a military first state. But beyond that, not much more sinks in of just how pervasive this ideology is, how it works in everyday life, and how it builds to make them the state they are today. So intransigent and so difficult to talk down from that ledge of military aggression. Of course, this first comes about during the Great Famine, when the country is on edge, and the leadership is looking for new ways to animate themselves. Now more than ever, it is impossible to claim that they can compete with their southern neighbors. And there's a new leader at the helm. Kim Il-sung has died and Kim Jong-il is now in power. So the idea that gets constructed at this time is that of a nation constantly under threat from foreign invasion, of constant fear and constant struggle. Sure, we may not be able to compete with other countries out there. Sure, we may be suffering right now, but that is because of what other countries are doing to us. And it's only by the grace of the new leader that we have not been conquered already. That's the rhetoric. That's the line. But how it lives in everyday life is what we're going to look at today. How it runs through novels and literature. How everyday civilians are made into military figures themselves. And how a nation is built inwards upon itself. Everyone is a soldier. Everyone is ready to fight, with propaganda again and again ready to enforce this at every broken moment. This is a fascinating look not just into North Korean literature specifically, but into North Korean society and the ideology that holds today. Now, as always, this podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. We've made a conscious decision here in the podcast not trying to advertise in any way. So if you like the podcast, if you listen and you want it to continue, it is important that you go to the links below and support us however you can. On that, and to walk us through military first ideology in North Korean literature, this is Kim Sunghee. Kim Sunghee, welcome to the Korea Now podcast.
Thank you for having me, Jed.
So I am really happy to have you on the podcast because this is a topic that I am very interested in, this military first idea and the realm around it. And before we do get into it and into your research, I might get you to briefly introduce yourself and give listeners an understanding of who you are and how it is that you came to this research.
Yeah, I'm working on North Korean literature and North Korean culture at the University of North Korean Studies at Seoul. But before coming here to University of North Korean Studies, I earned my Ph.D. degree, in East Asian Languages and Civilization from Harvard University in 2017. And while I'm working on my Ph.D. dissertation, I was interested in the Great Famine period, the so-called Arduous March in North Korea. During the Arduous March and after that, North Korean literature described the disaster in detail. They were honest about their famine and their miserable condition. They're so honest in literature. So I was interested in literature. I'm in the fiction and novel, Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il's biography about the period. So yeah, that's my starting point. Of my research.
So from that starting point, let's jump into the research. So we're going to have to dig a little bit back into history here, of course. So this is about military first, but we have to go back a little bit before the famine, perhaps. And you say that before the famine, North Korea was similar to many other countries. And so what was North Korea like before the famine? And then walk us up to those famine years and what happened there.
Yeah. Oh, well, in the late 1980s, as you know, the the Eastern Bloc collapsed. So
Mm.
the DPRK, I mean the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, I mean North Korea lost its former Soviet trade partners, and and they had difficulty in repaying their debt to China, and they failed to rebuild their older infrastructure after the collapse of the Eastern Bloc. But so Kim Il Sung, the founder of the DPRK, changed their economic policy. Their traditional policy concentrated on heavy industry, but after the collapse of the Soviet bloc, they changed the policy from heavy industry centered policy to light industry centered policy, and they focused more on agriculture. But the founder suddenly died in 1994. Then his son, named Kim Jong-il, didn't follow his father's line. I mean, he focuses on the military, not the industry, because the U.S. sanction on economy, the North Korea had been tightened in the early 1990s. So Kim Jong Il, the new leader, focused on the military, and then natural disaster like flood struck North Korea. That that's what happened in the early 1990s. I mean, in 1994 and
Yes.
1995. So North Korea suffered a great famine from 1994 to 1998. So they called the miserable period as arduous march. So
Yes.
yeah.
Now, there's a question there because for many people listening, they're just going to hear the word military first, and they're going to think this is a real military first idea. And of course, North Korea is a military first country. There's no denying that. But as you write here, this is not a response to a military threat. This is a response to an economic crisis.
That's true. Yeah. So during the arduous march between 240,000 and over 1 million North Korean people died of famine-related diseases from 1994 through 2000. So the number of victims was about 3% of the total population. In 1950s, Kim Il-sung wanted to build the country's economic foundation in a short time after the end of the Korean War. It seems likely that Kim Il-sung shared the idea of Zuri Kangshang self-reliance with Mao Zedong over his awareness of so-called North-South divide spurred him on to his heavy industry-centered policy. So what is certain is that the leadership of a newly liberated country, the North Korea, were eager to gain economic independence by expanding the means of production. I mean, large equipment and facilities. At the same time, Pyongyang sought to unionize farmers to support the agricultural workforce and add more workers to the large-scale manufacturing sector. So I think that's the starting point of Juche idea. I mean, in 1950s, North Korean regime wanted to build economic foundation, and they needed their ideology for the economic policy. So that's why Kim Il-sung coined the notion of Juche. But Juche actually, the Korean translation of shutai, Japanese word shutai, as you know, and shutai is a Japanese translation of the English term subject, right?
Yes.
The subject has several Japanese translations: shutai, shugo, shudai, shukan.
Yes.
Many translation, many ways of translation in Japanese. North Korean followed the Japanese model, Japanese translation. So juche was actually common noun, not proper noun. But in 1950s, Kim Il-sung began arguing they needed juche. They needed the subject. This
Yes.
subject is subject of action.
So like an acting subject, not so much not subjectivity in a philosophical sense, but just the subject as in the North Korean people acting in their own revolution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, well, in Western philosophy, subject really considered as subject was considered epistemological subject. That's individual subject. But in North Korea, in Soviet Union, and in wartime Japan, subject is collective, communal subject of action. That there is a little difference between the Soviet Union, Japan, and North Korea, and the West in terms of understanding the notion of subject. From
that, let's step forward into the moment, because of course many people listening will have a question in their minds here that if North Korea make this claim about themselves to be self-reliant, then when the famine hit, as you said, they were one of the big problems was that they were relying on the Soviet Union. So it seems like this was a country that was never self-reliant. So how we've got these two principles here, juche and then military first, which we're going to speak about through this literature. How close were North Koreans to actually living both of these ideas? Did they, of course, they both, they say that they are juche and they say that they are North, and they say that they are military first, but from the outside, it seems at least that they weren't very self-reliant at all.
Yeah, in 1990s, when famine struck North Korea, this is a unique system in North Korea. Most people in their 20s serve in the military. I mean, in North Korea. I mean, their military service period is 10 years. Such a long period. They're in the military. So they facilitate the young people in rebuilding their economy during the Great Famine. So the government didn't have to pay for their service, because the military service is mandatory. In the 1990s, the government of Kim Jong-il, North Korean government, transformed the economy by focusing on the military. I mean, they gave their primacy, the armed forces before the working forces. I mean, the traditional idea of Marxism is they giving the primacy to working classes. The notion of the dictatorship of proletariat was coined by Lenin in the early 20th century, right? But in the late 20th century, North Koreans began claiming the dictatorship of the armed forces. That's a huge transformation in socialist idea in the late 20th century. And so that's that's why I was interested in North Korean literature in the late 20th century, because their fiction, their novel began describing soldiers as the hero of the socialist revolution, not the working classes, but the armed forces were became the master of the North Korean revolution in the late 20th century. And so I began reading North Korean novels.
Now, that is an interesting shift there, of course, in socialist ideas, but it also begins to, in your research here, there's a shift that also happens. The focus is on soldiers, but they also transform the workers into soldiers themselves. So it's not an abandonment of the workers themselves. It's a complete reimagining of them. And of course, this is in response to the famine and the fear of death everywhere around them, that they try to encourage this. It's like an emotional change that you write in the mind. Sure. So I might get you to take us there and explain how they try to transform those workers into soldiers, at least mentally.
So there was a very interesting sentences from Nietzsche's this will to power. Nietzsche said, workers should learn to feel like soldiers. In the future, workers will be transformed into soldiers. That's the idea from Nietzsche's will to power. This book was written during the Second Industrial Revolution, but during the Third Industrial Revolution in the West, North Korean literature began describing workers as soldiers, because the basic idea of soldier workers or worker soldiers is they don't need payment.
Yes,
they don't need payment. They work for achievement or honor. So from government point of view, government doesn't make, or company doesn't make huge payment for the workers. So that's a huge shift from the traditional idea of capitalism or socialism to this particular kind of North Korean socialism in the late 20th century.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, let's build from that then, and let's introduce the North Korean novel that you focus on most centrally in the research I have before me, and that is the novel Taken Up, Bayonets. So let's start. What is this novel, and what is it about? And then we can talk about some of the smaller details afterwards.
I think you already know the information about the organization of writers in North Korea.
Yes.
In 1967, Kim Jong-il established the government-sponsored organization of writers called April 15 Literary Production Unit. This organization was founded in June 1967. But before 1967, the North Korean government, I mean Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il, conducted a spate of purge. I mean, they expelled many renowned writers from the literary circle, and they sent them to rural area. And so North Korean literature from 1967 depicted the leaders' achievement, like Kim Il-sung's anti-Japanese guerrilla activity.
So how does it shift then when it comes into this novel itself? So this novel is Taken Up, Bayonets, and let's talk about the central character. He's Kim Nang-chol, and he's building a hydroelectric power plant,
Oh, okay.
and he hates his job. He wants to fight,
Mm-hmm.
and he hates his job. So let's go into the story itself.
Okay.
Who is Kim Nang-chol, and what does his work look like, and why
Mm-hmm.
is he so upset with where he currently is?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this novel titled 총검을 들고 Taking a Bayonet is a volume, a part of Immortal Leadership series. Eternal Leadership is fictional biographies of Kim Jong-il. Yeah. So one of a fictional biography, as one of a fictional biography of Kim Jong-il, this novel 총검을 들고 depicts a North Korean soldier named Kim Nam-chol. Well, Kim Nam-chol is, I think, epitome of a North Korean soldier worker. Nam-chol, he is dispatched to the construction site where Kumgangsan hydroelectric power plant will be built. His commander ordered him to dig through the mountain to make a passage that will be used as a waterway. But government announced new official order but the order devastated Kim Nam-chol, because the order is to move the deadline to complete the grand scale plant forward, which means Nam-chol's job became even more labor intensive. So this is a description from the novel. It reads, there was, however, one soldier who was reluctant to carry out the unprecedented decision order. Carrying a bucket at his side, Private Kim Nam-chol lay down on a heap, on a pile of spoil. This is the beginning of the novel,
Yes.
titled 총검을 들고. So actually, this is a fictional biography of Kim Jong-il, and this novel was written by very renowned novelist, North Korean novelist named Song Sang-won. Song Sang-won is a member of April Literary Production Unit, and he described the stereotype of soldier workers during Great Famine. But in this fiction, Kim Nam-chol was the son of Colonel Kim Dong-hwan, right? So Kim Dong-hwan is a Navy colonel, but yeah, still.
Let's talk about his father, as you mentioned there, because this is interesting. Because you mentioned that this is a fictional biography of Kim Il-sung, but it also is a fictional biography of Kim Tong-wan, because he is this person who, in real life, based on a real life event, lands a submarine in South Korea in 1990. Yeah, so that's. Who was he in real life, and who is he as a character? Because in the book, he's contrasted with his son, as his father is this unquestioned noble character, and it's contrasted to a son who's full of doubt. So who was he in real life, and who is he in the story?
So his father's name is Kim Dong-hwan, Navy colonel in the fiction, but this is actually a real person named Kim Dong-won. So in the fiction, Kim Dong-hwan, the fictional figure Kim Dong-hwan, composed a song, a paean to Kim Jong-il. So the song is very interesting, I think. The song is as follows. If I burn myself for you, here you is Kim Jong-il, I will glow as a red smoke. If I burn myself for you, I will be burnt to red ash. Oh, General, I will be human bomb for you. This is a song in the fiction 총감을 들고, but this song models itself on very traditional form of 시조.
Yes.
Oh, colonel, oh, general, I will be human bound for you. So this paean foreshadows its composer's fate. I mean, the Colonel Kim Dong-hwan killed his 10 subordinates and committed suicide rather than surrender to South Korean army after when his submarine ran aground on the South Korean coast. I mean, east coast of Korean Peninsula. But this account is based on real event, the Gangneung submarine infiltration incident in 1996. I still remember this incident because my friend, many of my friends participated in the military operation at the time.
Oh.
So, yeah. According to an American source, the director of the Maritime Department, Colonel Kim Dong-won, not Kim Dong-hwan, killed 11 North Koreans, including himself. Owa was killed along with his subordinate by someone else on a hilltop approximately 8 kilometers southwest his southwest of where his submarine had run aground. So it's quite likely that Song Sang-won modeled the fictional Kim Dong-hwan after real Kim Dong-won, right? But I'm not sure his son, I mean Kim Dong-won's son, worked in the construction site of Kumgangsan hydroelectric power plant. But anyway, Song Sang-won, the writer, attempted to connect the bloodline between real person Kim Dong-won with the soldier workers at the construction site. So the purpose,
in some ways, he's also trying to connect the change in mindset between the two people as well, because he has the son failing and complaining and not appreciating what he should have, and the father is this self-sacrificing person, and it really comes to a head when the son returns to his unit. So let's go to that moment. So the son goes home and complains to his father, and his father is not too happy about this because his son's not the loyal warrior that he hopes him to be. And then his son returns to the hydroelectric plant, and he sees this scene, this very strange scene where where he's returning, and out the side of the plant they're mourning the death of him. Take us to that scene and what happens there and why it's so important.
Well, Kim Nam-chul and his father lived in Pyongyang. They were very privileged class. They belonged to very privileged class in Pyongyang. But his father, I mean Kim Nam-chul's father, wants Kim Nam-chul to work in construction site because that's the mission given to Kim Nam-chul by the party. But Kim Nam-chul was very unhappy. He is unhappy with the job, so he asked his father to change his job. But well, as you know, his father was very angry, and so Kim Nam-chul returned to his workplace. But he missed a child singing a requiem. This is a very strange scene, so I'd like to read the entire part of the scene. So this is the scene. Then a sound came from somewhere. It sounded like a song, a crying, a murmuring. Namche realized that it was part of Partisans' requiem and believed that it came from the bottom of his heart and resonated in his mind, but the sounds was coming from elsewhere. There were 3 burial mounds on the patch of dried grass on a hill. A boy places a branch from a green pine tree on the graves and stood before them. Then Namche asked, "Who died?" "Namche," the boy answered. "Who?" Namche didn't hear and asked again. "Namche buried here." The boy spoke the name of the deceased. So this is a very interesting scene because Namche, on the way back to his place of duty, saw his tomb, his own tomb.
Yes.
So standing before graves, boy sings an elegy, once sung before fallen anti-Japanese guerrilla during the Japanese occupation of Korea. But the person who died, who is buried, is the boy's father. So this is what happened in the construction site. The tunnel in which the construction crew were kept in, and a company commander, the boy's father, was killed. The head officer of a construction site, however, lied to boy's family to gain time to restore the body, his father's body, because his father's body was severely damaged under the rocks. The head officer think the only thing he can give is the victim's restored body. So the head officer of the construction site lied to the boy's family. So the boy was singing a requiem not for his father but for Namche. So, but Namche think he is already died because he had to die. His company in the construction site, because all members of his company were killed in the tunnel. So then Namche finally comes to consider himself to be a dead man. So yeah, so I try to connect the dead man here in this fiction with Giorgio Agamben's Homo sacer, the sacrifice man. So because I found it very interesting that in the Agamben's notion, Agamben's notion explained the status of North Korean people during the Great Famine. I mean, yeah.
So yeah, from that, that's built into this question of labor and how it and work and how it sits in the North Korean mind here, because a lot of this is building up this idea. So Namchol runs away to see his father for 2 reasons. He doesn't see the work he's doing as military work when he should. And he's also, importantly, he doesn't have the will. It's too hard. He's been asked to do too much. And this becomes important here. And you write, this is a psychological system that they're building up here in North Korea, where it's not just that you need to have more will and you need to be stronger, but also that there is a certain rhythm to labor and to work it and to keep it up. And this all builds up to Kim Il-sung being the highest virtue. So I might open up that particular aspect of your research, this way that North Koreans build labor into this rhythm of life in a way that is psychologically so satisfying.
Yeah. So this system you talked about a conscience system. I mean, well, it's very interesting to see the notion of Liangxim conscious emerged in the early 1960s in North Korea. Well, before the early 1960s, North Korean literature didn't describe the psychological status called Liangxim, conscious. But after Kim Il-sung established his dictatorship through a series of purge, North Korean literature began describing conscious in fictions. It's very interesting because, in Ruth Benedict, Chrysanthemum and Thought describes conscious culture. Gift culture is a more developed one than the shame culture in Japan is, right? So this is much like religious culture, I think. So in 1960s, from 1960s until today, North Korean governments attempted to establish kind of political religion based on the psychological system called the Liangxim system.
And so from that system itself, let's talk about that idea of party conscience. Yeah. And you mentioned a little earlier that the workers, that these writers who write about the workers and write about the military first, they are part of this party conscience deep inside them. And this is very interesting exchange that happens that you write about. And it's an American journalist who travels to North Korea and he visits Pyongyang in 1991. And he asks them about their work and their privileged class. And he gets this response, which is what you might expect in some ways, where they're telling him that every day they're being instructed to go and live and work out in the farmlands and in the factories themselves. So what place did writers have in this system and this military first new structure of North Korean society?
Well, after Kim Jong-il established April 15 literary production unit, government began sending writers to rural area, our construction site, our factory, because this is a system of training writers. In the working site, writers are working with workers, and that's a part of a training program for writers. And through working, writers earned their conscious as writers, their self-conscious as writers in the working site. So Kim Jong-il always saying writers is the mouthpiece for Liangxim of the age and Liangxim of popular masses. People. So to be masterpieces for Liangxim, writers should work with workers, and they conducting meditation. They conducting kind of spiritual practice by working with people. So that's how writers became masterpiece for Liangxim, and actually the engineers of human soul. Engineers of human soul was coined by Stalin in the early 20th century. To be the engineer of human soul and mouthpiece for Liangxim, writers should conduct labor, and they they should live with workers. That's the basic training system for writers in North Korea that was established by Kim Jong-il in the late 1960s.
So from that, you mentioned something very interesting. You said labor as meditation. And you've got a section later on in your research which talks about labor as meditation and how this military first and the focus on work affected the average day person. You write here, I'm going to quote, meditation is a spiritual practice for self-control, self-cultivation, or the governing of the self. And you go on to say, as a spiritual practice to train one's mind and suppress one's negative feelings. So what were North Korean writers trying to do when they tried to make labor into meditation?
Well, this idea was inspired by George Agamben. George Agamben argued manual labor was not separate from meditation in monastery medieval in the medieval Europe. So, and more accurately, the manual labor was a part of recitation of the scripture. That's the idea of George Agamben. I was inspired by Agamben. Then I began thinking labor can be a meditation, particularly during great famine in North Korea. The government attempted to transform labor into a meditation, because meditation can contribute to social stability, right? And I mean, I wanted to expand the notion of meditation into a communal action, communal labor in North Korea.
So it's a sacred kind of idea here.
Yeah.
You write that it has a certain sacred, almost religiosity to it that you should. And you write here that again, quoting Nietzsche, which is great. You write things like the North Korean must begin to separate the idea of work from wages. There must be a complete separation of the mind, and to do that, you have to make work and labor into a religion almost.
Yeah, that's true. So, but I was more inspired by Max Weber more than Nietzsche, because my concept of North Korea is their culture has some general features, some universal features with outside world. I mean, their notion of work was kind of same to the Weberian idea of labor, because in the Weberian idea of labor, Weber considered labor as a spiritual practice. He said labor must be performed as if it were an absolute end in itself. I mean, he called labor as a calling, vocation. So workers should work for the sake of work. So that's a very interesting idea to me, because I saw capitalist labor as an activity for earning money, but the Weberian idea of labor is opposite to my conjecture. I mean, labor should be performed. I think Weberian idea of labor is characterized by a certain kind of rhythm. High wages over a system of piece rates cannot accelerate the speed of work. Instead, Weber argued a quick and steady pace of labor is ensured by long, arduous process of education. So, as a result, it is considered to be and performed as a sacred calling. I think it's almost same to the Kim Jong-il's idea of labor. So Kim Jong-il said the government should educate people that labor is a sacred duty, and workers should work not for money but for the revolution. So that's the idea of Kim Jong-il, and I found some similarity between the Weberian idea and Kim Jong-il's idea of labor. So that's the point I want to make in my paper.
Yes. Let's step from that and step back into the narrative, into the story. And this is interesting because our hero, Kim Nang-chol, he's returning back home and he's seen this scene where people are mourning his own death. Erroneously, he's not really dead, of course. And it begins to change this thing because this idea of considering himself to be already dead, it becomes an important prospect in here and an important theme that to already imagine his own death suddenly feels this idea that he is he should lose any too much self-concern for himself and just simply embrace what he is. And this really grows out of it. It's not a biological death, of course, you're right. It's a social life. So in a sense, he misses his chance. He wasn't in the tunnel. He doesn't die. And so in some ways, he's excommunicated. He's shamed by the society, and he suffers from this. So I might yet open up that idea there of this image of him returning back to his site and what happens to him. And this idea of him dying a certain kind of death.
Well, after Kim Nam-chul met the boy singing a requiem for him, Nam-chul is seized with the hallucination of his excommunication. Nam-chul considered himself to be already dead, not biologically, as you said, but he considered himself as a dead man anyway. I mean, that means the end of his social life, excommunication. So I think this is a recurring subject, recurring motive in North Korean literature. Many North Korean literary works that describe this psychological status called excommunication. In Nam-chul's story, this new life is expressed as the right to work and die. I mean, this novel describes him to lose the right to work. So this means the end of social life. But so this right to work, even to right to die, is conferred on Nam-chul. Again, conferred on Nam-chul when he meets Kim Jong-il. But he lost the right to work and die because he abandoned his duty. So that's the excommunication described in the novel. But he meets Kim Jong-il anyway. So Kim Jong-il conferred the right to work and die on Kim Nam-chul again. So Yeah. So I
And
quote, yeah.
that is fascinating there. I'll
Hmm.
get you to come to that quote, but it also has this extraordinary religious idea of rebirth. When you said then that this idea of excommunication is very common in North Korean literature of this
Hmm.
time,
Hmm.
uh, it seems, and you write here as well, that it has religious overtones. It's like almost a Christianity kind of message of a rebirth of,
Hmm.
yes, you're excommunicated and it's the worst thing that can happen to you.
Hmm.
And then suddenly through the great leader, you can be reborn and rediscover this purpose.
Hmm. I don't want to argue North Korean literature is heavily influenced by Christianity, but anyway, I found some Christian aspects in North Korean literature, as in 총검을 들고, well, Namchul is born again because he regained the right to work and die. He gives a kind of a testimony in front of his workers, the 10,000 soldier workers at the construction site of Kumgangsan hydroelectric power plant. And I quote the long uh, paragraphs from the novel.
Mm,
So this this part is very interesting. I mean, well, so he says he he urges uh, the workers in the construction site to die to self and try to emulate Kim Jong Il, and then I mean he urges the audience to be born again. So he said, "Yes, verily, only the Juche type blood must run in our body." Well, this is very interesting term, blood, P. And
mm,
they, I mean, the government and the literary works attempt to transform North Korean people by
mm,
injecting Juche type blood in the worker's body, right? So he said, even if it is given by your parents, wrong blood must not be mixed. Never happen. If any of you allow that to happen, you will be a weak being, 나약한 존재, and 버림받은 존재, a forsaken being,
mm,
excommunicated from the ranks of one flesh, 일심동체에 대어. So yeah, so
mm,
this is a very interesting idea. I think in the late 1990s, the North Korean government sought to reform human body. I mean, by human being. This is a kind of a human reform conducted by North Korean government in the late 20th century. But this part reminds me of John's Gospel. So, as a Presbyterian, I was very fascinated by this part. So in the John Gospel, Jesus tells Nicodemus, "You must be born again." Then again, in North Korean fiction, Kim Nam-chul urges Kim Nam-chul urges North Korean workers to be born again. There's, I think, so. This is I found some similarity between Christianity and North Korean political religion called the Juche idea. But I don't want to argue Christianity influenced the North Korean practice of North Korean literature because we can find uh, similar cases even in Buddhism. Even in Buddhism, I mean, Buddhism and Jainism, the Indian ancient religion, well, emphasizes suffering as a way of transforming human body, human soul. So we can find similar cases even in Indian religion called the Smarana tradition in Indian religion. Smarana means one who labors, toils, and exerts themselves for some higher religious purpose. So, suffering, bodily suffering can change your body, your soul. That's common idea even in Buddhism. So what I want to argue in this paper is North Korean literature of working. I mean, their political religion share some similarities with other religious culture like Buddhism and Christianity in common.
So let's step forward from there and talk about that idea of death a little bit more as we're coming to the end here. Really interesting that you found in the research here of this Great Famine period and Songan period was the way that death is written about by North Korean writers. And you write that it's accelerated in a way, but it's always a voluntary action, which is really fascinating from the outside looking in. So you write here, I'm going to quote, even death by accident, disease, poverty, and war should be described as self-directed and willing actions. This idea that suicide is almost praised in a sense that it's always willing to die, always sitting there, that every death that comes away of a North Korean, if they're working hard and if they're in the right place, is a willing action. And it speaks to the mindset of what this kind of writing and propaganda was trying to do to create the North Koreans that were willing to die at this time.
Well, this paper is from my dissertation. When I was writing my dissertation, well, I was shocked by Syrian civil war at the time in 2015. Well, during Syrian civil war, the ISIS warrior carry out suicidal attack. Right, car bomb. Car bomb is their major weapon to destroy government facilities. So, well, I found some similarity between those jihadi warriors and North Korean workers described in the North Korean literature in the late 1990s. Well, during the Great Famine, death is a common very common. So governments try to justify the death as a martyrdom in the late 1990s. So during and even after the Great Famine, North Korean literature often praises, suicide as a noblest and most heroic finale of a life. But in reality, North Korean people didn't believe. North Korean people didn't believe the death is the most heroic finale of a life. But I think North Korean people still kept reading the novels because the novel forms a kind of community, literary community. So that's why North Korean people keep reading North Korean literature, even though they don't believe, they don't trust, they don't believe the message in the literature. What I want to tell you is North Korean people keep reading literature not for believing, but for belonging. As a Presbyterian, I go to church not for believing, but for belonging. So I don't believe in the God, but no, I go to church because I want my child, my son, be part of a community. I want to give him a sense of belonging. But I think it's same to North Korea. North Korean people stick to North Korean culture of personality cult, but well, that might give them a sense of belonging. I think that's why they keep reading North Korean literature, North Korean propaganda literature. So, yeah.
And
So,
it probably explains why that excommunication theme in the literature is so important as well, I imagine.
since the Great Famine in North Korea has been in permanent crisis, permanent disaster. Every year they suffered from natural disaster and kind of starvation and economic recession, but they have managed to survive. I mean, by sticking to each other.
It's an interesting thought that clearly is in the literature here. But I want to finish the interview with the way that you finish your article here and your research, because this is fascinating. So for many people listening, they may think, okay, this is just a novel. It's just literature about the suffering in the country and how they should die and the kind of thing, and how you should lose your concern for your own death. And yet you finish your book with this really, it's this analogy, and it works so well here. So you write in 2005, a South Korean journalist interviews a North Korean defector. And I might get you to introduce it here, but he begins to explain almost the identical situation to the novel itself, and he lived in it. And he uses his quotes. He says, it's a city of death, it's a tunnel of death, a reservoir of death. And I'll get you to introduce that interview and just how close that novel was to the real life experience of this man.
No, Kim Nam-chul finally survived. Kim Nam-chul survives, but the factual account of the construction site, however, is more horrendous than the fictionalized history. A North Korean defector said that by 2004, 30,000 workers were buried at the mountain in front of the construction site of Kumgangsan hydroelectric power plant. 95, according to the defector's testimony, 95 out of 100 soldiers in his unit were killed. Yeah, 95% of his unit was killed. It's horrendous. Or severely injured and moved out. They moved out due to malnutrition. And the construction construction of the power plant consumed the workers. Only 5 of the defectors' unit remained healthy during their tour of duty. So this is common in North Korea during arduous march. I mean, over 90% of workers were injured or killed, and very small number of people remain healthy and survive. So I think this explains how and why 3% of North Korean population died during the arduous march. But anyway, Kim Jong-il's government attempted to devise a labor as a means of meditation, social stability, and urge people to shorten their lifespan by working to death. So
I'm going to quote that defector here, because many people listening may think, okay, they were reading the novels They were reading about military first, but they didn't believe the message. They didn't internalize the message. They didn't. But this is a defector, and he's outside of North Korea. He's now free of the country. And as he describes his experiences, he writes, I'm going to quote here, "My fellow soldiers and I work as digging a ditch in the unit." As in, he is a worker, and yet he keeps describing himself as a soldier. So as a final note here, how successful was this narrative when you speak to defectors like this? It seems very successful, that it really did get right into their psyche and their psychology and really affect them in the way that it still holds on defectors that have left the country.
Well, soldiers expected to be ready to die in the battlefield. That's the Beijing mindset for soldiers. And North Korean government tried to transform workers into soldiers who are ready to die. So that's what happened during the military first age in the late 1990s and the early 21st century. And so that's the meaning of a military first revolution. I mean Sungun policy. And by Sungun policy, North Korean government reformed North Korean population's psychology. Their psyche. I think this system worked through the communal life and labor. The government established in the mid 20th century, and through the crisis in the late 20th century, the government adjusted the established system to new environment of a great famine and economic recession at the turn of the 20th century. And so this is successful, I think, because North Korean regime anyway survived. So the resilience of the system is in this particular psychological system. I think that this system that North Korean government established in the late 20th century.
Yes, and when you connect it like that, it makes a lot of sense. That's a great note to leave the podcast on. So the article that I've been using for research here is The Prosody of Working and Narrative of Martyrdom, Daily Life and Death in North Korean Literature during the Great Famine and the Early Military First Age, 1994 to 2002. I'm going to link that below for people that want to go and find the details for themselves. There's a lot more in there, and I encourage listeners to go and read it for themselves. On that, Kim Sunghee, thanks for coming on the Korea Now podcast.
Thank you for having me, Jad.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. I really hope you enjoyed it. This is just a final reminder that we've made a conscious decision here on the Korea Now podcast not to run advertising. And so the podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. So if you do want it to continue, please consider supporting the podcast at the PayPal or Patreon links attached below. Or importantly, you can share, like, or comment on the podcast across social media. And on that, I hope to see you again for the next episode. Thanks again for listening.